When I was a kid, I thought I wanted to be a cop, mostly because of my favorite film series, Beverly Hills Cop. Hear me out. Look, I used to watch open mouth as Eddie Murphy swung off the back of a truck or someone shot a gas tank and the car exploded in a fiery blaze. Eddie had me really convinced that's what my life would be like as a cop. Fun, adventurous, full of morality, like we're bringing down the system and the terrible people upholding it. And believe it or not, I held on to that idea for a long, long time. In fact, it was reinforced by other shows and movies like Batman and The Wire. And it makes me think the way that we develop our imagination as kids heavily influences our beliefs as adults. So today, I want to explore a specific type of media that's infiltrated our imaginaries. The kind that centers policing, cops, more specifically, talking about Copaganda. I'm Darren from Push Black, and you're listening to Black History Year. Now, some of us may know the word propaganda, this combination, this portmanteau between the words cop and propaganda. I myself first heard about it around, 2014, 2015, right after the acquittal of Darren Wilson for the murder of Michael Brown. And during this time, I learned that this country is uniquely positioned policing. I'm talking about the police officer, cops, the entire legal infrastructure, as the preeminent hero of our society. Now, usually discussions about propaganda focuses on how the news distorts events, and look, that's absolutely true. And there's a whole nother thread that we don't even think about, and that's commercial properties like films, TV shows, cartoons, toys. I'm talking about the stuff we may passively consume without realizing the messages we're internalizing about policing, safety, or even justice. And when you take a minute to sit back and really think about the sheer volume of media that centers police narratives like this, oh, it almost feels dystopian. But don't take my word for it. Take it from our guest, Chenjerai Kumanyika. Now, Chenjerai is a journalist, author, and organizer working at the intersections of social justice and emerging media and cultural and creative industries. He's also the host of Empire City, a super dope and mind-blowing podcast about the history of policing, dropping this fall. Now, we here at Push Black, we're such big fans of it, we're also executive producing it. But look, today's conversation might have you looking at your favorite movie or TV shows in a new and interesting way, because beneath the layers of plot and character, oh, you might find just a piece of propaganda. Let's see if you can flag it before we do. What's up, fam? Before we dive into the episode, I have one small favor to ask. Please spread the word about Black History Year on social media. Podcasting is competitive, y'all, and the best way to grow is through your promotion. You can shout out this episode or share one lesson from it you found super interesting. Just tag us at We Are Push Black on Instagram and TikTok so more folks can access the Black history they didn't teach us in school. Your support means the world to us, and your minute of effort makes our hours of work worth it. So thank you, fam. Yo, how you doing today, Chenjerai?
What's going on? What's going on? How you doing, Darren? What's going on, D?
I'm good. Excited to be here.
Yes.
Well, before we begin our robust conversation today on propaganda, we'd like to begin all of our Black History Year episodes with one question we raise to all our guests. And simply, we want to know from your perspective, Chenjerai, what does Black liberation look like to you?
Oh, you okay? So that's like a
That's a little heavy one to start with.
That's a heavy question. Yeah. Well, I think that, for me, Black liberation is a world broadly where people have the conditions to be able to reach their highest potential. People have the conditions that they need to make a life, and all the things that are part of that life, which include joy, pleasure, to challenge ourselves, and all those things, and to love each other. And so, I think that Black liberation is sort of trying to produce that world and be in that world. And one other important thing I need to say is that in that way, I do think that Black liberation is linked up with other kinds of liberation. Right?
Yes.
And it's also, I think, in some ways, it's on the vanguard of liberation for everybody.
Thank you for raising up that point. Absolutely. Our struggles are not disconnected from others in the world. We know that we are combating against systems and long-held ideologies. Here at Push Black, we hold on to the political line of decoloniality, which
Yes.
absolutely recognizes just the multiple oppressions that affect all of us. So thank you so much for lifting that up. One thing that you mentioned in your response is pleasure, and how that's absolutely important for thinking about Black liberation. I raised that up because today's conversation for some folks may not be too pleasurable, because we're going to be talking about some media objects, some cultural objects that a lot of us, including myself, have received pleasure from. And that's this notion of propaganda. Well, just to set the stage, Chenjerai, before we even begin to unpack and define that word, very curious to hear more about your work that you're doing, archiving, detailing the history of policing. And in particular, I'm curious in your research, if you could point us to a historical moment where this mythology of policing began to be propagated.
Absolutely. Well, in the wake of what has happened over the last decade in this country, movements about the police and that sort of fighting against the police are very old in this country. They didn't start with what's called Black Lives Matter. But observing things in the past decade, what I began to see is that everybody's talking about police. Police saturate the headlines in cities and outside of the city, everywhere. They're on the political agenda. But but what I found was that when people talk about the history of the police, they don't talk about it in very robust ways.
Mm,
Most people don't know, like, so I think in the sort of like struggle world, there are people who actually know quite a bit, but you might hear people say things like police came from slave patrols, right? I mean,
right.
I've even heard there's even some police chiefs who have acknowledged that basic fact. But that's sort of like a sentence, not a history, right?
Yes.
Under what conditions? If I was to ask people which police departments were first, what were the specific conditions that they were created under? What were the political projects? What was at work? Um, and how was that also specific to different areas? Like those are things that I didn't know.
Yeah.
And so just out of my own desperate curiosity, I felt that that's something that should be right at the center, because how can we be trying to solve and sort of, to borrow the term from some of our other comrades, like to shake off this oppressive system if we don't even understand where it is. And for those who, there are folks out there who believe in police, but I would say even more so for them. Like if you're someone who believes in police because for some reason you think that that's a solution to the harm that we experience and the
Mhm.
harm is real, then
Yes.
you should know the history. What has worked? What hasn't worked, right? And that was what plunged me into this project, which has overtaken my life for the last 4 years.
Okay, okay, we're gonna dive into that project
Mhm.
once we reach the segment where we start to discuss some abolitionist media. But
Right.
before we jump forward,
Oh yeah,
yeah, yeah,
right. Yeah,
please.
and that's why I just want to say you asked me another part of the question which I didn't answer, but I will get to it. Like where the mythology starts. Yeah.
Yes, 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 please. If you want to add to that.
Well, I will say, it's interesting. Like it depends on how much you want to nerd out on it. I was talking to the brilliant scholar Fred Moten,
Oh,
and Fred Moten was saying that there are philosophical works, Kant and others, who actually say policing actually starts deep in the mind. It's a philosophical problem, not just a historical problem, right? You see, even Kant, who basically says that the wildness of the imagination has to be regulated, in order to try to produce knowledge. Excuse
wow.
me. So he kind of like blew my mind and had me thinking about it a different way. But I do want to say that, of course, African people have been on the earth for hundreds and thousands of years before anybody else was on the scene. And I think, to act like somehow policing started in Europe
Mm,
and the problem of policing or the problem of how do we keep each other safe. I
mm,
mean, I think there was thinking along that lines developing all along the course of human history, which is of course African history for this really long period. But in terms of the way that we use that actual term police, this has its origins in Europe, and
mm,
it really it's kind of like in sort of medieval Europe, and you start to see this idea of police as a way of governing take over, right in the in between, I would say, when Europe stopped being governed by monarchs and royalty, right? Because
yes.
in monarchs and royalty, the whole idea was like you don't have any rights, right? We
Mm-hmm,
you're a subject.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
as modernity starts to emerge, the idea is, well, now we maybe like we're trying to move towards enlightenment and democracy, but we still kind of want to control things. In fact, we want to sort of what Mark Neal Clueless calls, we want to fabricate
Whoa.
social order, right?
Yes, yes, because
You,
concerns around property began to rise then, right? With the fall of
yes,
monarchs, right? You have more capitalists coming on the scene. Okay,
there
okay.
you go. So I think that, the mythology around this idea, if you want to look at the word policing, really certainly gained steam there. I'm always, as a historian, I'm always cautious about saying where something started,
Yes. Yeah.
but
Origins of
things
state.
often start different places. And I think in some ways, policing is like that, right? I often think about how I don't want to say that there's nothing about policing that's natural.
Mm.
But when you have certain political conditions, you have people who have property, resources, they want to expand, protect and expand. They have inconvenient people that they need to put down or dispossess, from their land and from their rights. You will see policing emerge in those contexts, whether it is South Carolina or New Orleans in the US, whether it's in, Barbados, whether it's in like Europe and in London, right? When people are being sort of what they say, as whether people being disciplined to the wage, learning like now it's going to be about the wage, you know what I'm
Ooh.
saying?
Ooh.
So and then you start to have people talking about crime and order and all these things in media in ways that sets the stage for forms of propaganda.
Ooh. Ooh. We. There's so much there. Let me just try to touch on like two things real quick. One, so archaic depictions of policing. I love that you bring up Kant. So it begins in like this philosophical realm. I
Right.
immediately thought of like Thomas Hobbes and like the Leviathan.
Ooh.
This
Ooh,
idea that
yeah.
in order to control chaos, you need some super arcing state that has a monopoly on like violence, a monopoly on power.
Mm.
Otherwise, like the world is just chaos without that.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
Also, it made me think about we're gonna touch upon this once we start to get into like some propaganda examples. But the rise of like detective fiction.
Yes.
So Foucault talks about this in Discipline and Punishment, specifically like as you called out, like once the fall of the monarchs began and you get the rise of this business class, this capitalist class, the idea of what a criminal was shifted from like, okay, you commit a law against the king to like, no, you're actually like infringing upon property rights. So you get a lot more media that's really interested in thinking about just detective work or the I don't know, just this idea of criminality being kind of inbred in people. Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I think yeah, the way you're laying it out is so beautiful, and I love that you're bringing even these other philosophical traditions in, because you start to see. I mean, the fact that you're pointing to Hobbes is one of these things that can show you that right at that moment when Europe is expanding its empire, but also claiming that it's enlightened, right? You see that the fact that that there's certain ways of beginning to think about reigning in chaos at that moment that are being applied, both in philosophical ways but also in material political ways, right? And I think that that's really, yeah, that's and I yeah so I think that you know thinking about the criminal as like one is just a colonial subject, right? As
Mm,
even as we allegedly, well, we actually are moving, sort of into coloniality in a way,
yes.
but right, it's like it's like, but also even someone who, when it comes to workers, one interesting moment of kind of criminalization is this the invention of the vagrant, right? The idea that
Ah,
someone
yeah.
who's just like not working, right? And we see this discourse of vagrancy a lot of different places in history. You can see it all the way, in Europe after plagues where workers had a lot of leverage and they had to figure out how can we lower workers' leverage? We have to label them as vagrants and force them to work. You
Mhm.
see it in early Atlanta coming out of the Civil War. I mean, what I'm saying? Like where now we have free black people and they're trying to figure out what's the labor force to build
Surplus
Atlanta.
population.
So the
Mhm.
vagrant, and the reason why I say that is because the place where that mythology of the vagrant and right as a criminal figure, right? The idea that not working to build up capital, to build up empire makes you a criminal, that takes shape in the media. The Elastic Constitution Journal is one of the main papers that pushes that right at that time.
Whoa. Whoa. Okay, there's a big bomb. Okay, we gotta find that. We gotta show the people that. Thank you for dropping that reference. Yo, okay. So with this kind of brief and basic history kind of laid out, at a very high level, Chenjerai, I'm really curious. How do you even talk about propaganda? How would you define it in your own words? How would you even identify it when you come across it?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, I recognize it all the time. I'm sort of it's a lens. It's almost like I don't even look at it like, is something propaganda or not? I look at it like, to what extent is it propaganda? Because so
Mm,
much of the way that we talk about crime, public safety, and all those things in this country is affected by propaganda, because these basic assumptions are there. So I would describe it as a way of thinking about safety that sort of really favors policing, favors incarceration, and all those things. And then it's sort of talks about like our investment. So it's one way of describing what harm is to start out with, right? So in
mhm,
other words, harm is if someone, breaks a window, or if someone assaults one other individual, that's considered harm. That's defined as a crime.
mhm.
But for example, a company that steals the wages of thousands or millions of people, uh, uh, um, businesses that destroy the environment, which leads to the death and chaos for all kinds of people, even war crimes that are occurring right now in Gaza. None of those things, right, become crimes and harm that we have to erect a system around to fix. But the person who like broke the window or stole something, that becomes a crisis. And that way of thinking about our harm and safety is and what the solutions and what our investments in our society are going to be, that to me is propaganda. Pardon me, that to me is propaganda, the specific subset of propaganda called propaganda.
Ooh, ooh, thank you. Thank you for putting a bow on that. Actually, I just want to raise up this little personal anecdote. As you mentioned, the ways in which that we think about who's a criminal, who's not a criminal. When it comes to like the business class, we don't often identify folks as being like, okay, no, this is a crime. This person has committed harm, and we need to rectify this situation. Years ago, I used to be a labor organizer, and I remember having
Mm,
conversations with the National Labor Relations Board. We had this particular target in mind, and I was still green, and I assumed that there would be some sort of almost like a dragnet type perp walk of this particular person committing these harms on their workers. And the
right.
NLRB told me there's no police for the NLRB. No, that has to work itself out different. I was like, oh, wait a minute. So if you steal my wages, I can't get a cop to come and grab you. But like if you get mugged or whatever, then it looks different. Okay, thank you.
That is wow.
Um,
That's a fact. I would love to hear that. I want to hear that whole story. That's
Okay,
amazing.
that's gonna
Right.
all right. We're gonna do that right after the interview. We definitely gonna
Yeah.
rap about that. But
Yeah.
actually, I want to share these stats with you because one thing that you mentioned, most folks don't realize just how pervasive this is in our media ecology, particularly in this country. I came across this report titled "Normalizing Injustice." This was written in 2020 by Color of Change and the USC Annenberg Norman Lear Center. So essentially, this was a comprehensive study of how television's most popular genres excludes writers of colors, and particularly how it miseducates people about the criminal justice system and makes racial injustice really
Mm,
palatable or acceptable. I just want to raise up two stats, two findings, and just hear your response to them real quickly. But this study found that programs that involve law enforcement in one way or another make up nearly 20% of all scripted shows on network
wow.
television in this country. So, like,
Wow.
yeah, 20%, right? And then they also tell us that they analyzed the diversity of writers across these rooms and these genres, and they found that out of the 9 police series that they studied, 0 had black showrunners, and 3 had no black writers at all.
Mm.
Um, I'm curious, how do you respond to this, Chenjerai?
Well, I think it's stunning when you see the data like that. Even no matter how cynical we want to be or what we think we know, just to see the data laid out like that, like wow, this is what it is right now in 2024. At the same time, there's a part of me that's not surprised because as somebody who's a producer and consumer of media, right, I see the way that so much of the industry runs on ideas of crime, true crime, right? Police procedurals are a tremendous um, documentary. I mean, pardon me, procedurals are a huge genre, and it's almost like a lot of other stories have that kind of cop idea based in them, even if they're not. And I know we're gonna get to that a little later in the conversation. If you think, for example, about podcasting, which is with the genre we're making right now, and that I'm making with this show, I mean, true crime has been a huge boom of podcasting. You think about cable television, what comes on at in a night, the kinds of shows people are watching, to kind of to see what scandal happened, who got all these other things. It's all being driven by this, so I'm not surprised that it's that widespread. It's almost like it takes over so much of our imagination. And, you know, and sort of doing some of the research to prep for this conversation, um, you know, just to see how much media
Mm.
was like literally the technologies, right, of media, like companies like Kodak, and the idea of film, the way the film RCA, the way the film genre spreads, the whole idea of of the suspect film, or the, what I'm saying, or like,
Ooh.
the sort of in NYPD, George Matzel made the Rogues Gallery, all these portraits of sort of these criminals, like how much these same ideas of criminalizing people, of getting the idea that criminals are born, and sort of erasing the sociological creation and all of that. Like all of that is driving technology, it's
Mm.
driving media industries, just the creation of these industries, and now, of course, innovation within these industries into different genres, shows that we're watching. So I mean, and I mean, on a more lighter, I mean, I don't want to trivialize it, because as we know, this stuff is related to death and harm. But look, all of us at the end of the day, at some point, we kick back and we want to, we want to get our head out the game. And if you turn on Netflix, even me, right? Like I'm sitting here, I'm making a whole show on police, right? And a
Yeah.
show that very much I hope is functioning in abolitionist vein. But sometimes I turn on, like Netflix will be like, yo, did you know this murder happened? And then and this happened and it was never found. And I'm like, for a couple of minutes, I'm like, yo, really?
Yeah.
it takes something. Sometimes I find myself getting pulled in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh man. Okay. So this, I have to mention this quote. This comes from Dream Hampton. So she was interviewed right after the killing of Michael Brown,
Mm.
and in her podcast interview, she raised this statement. Really, just kind of alarms me when I think about where we are today, but also how we got here. But she says that police officers have become the most developed characters on television over the past 30 years, at least
Wow.
since the Kent State tragedy, right? She feels that once this tragedy took place, there needed to be an influx of media shaping folks' concerns around policing intentionally. And since then, the police officer has been the most well developed character just in the American media ecology. And yeah, I'm curious, what does that do to our imaginaries? So you mentioned its impact on our imaginations, how we think about certain concepts. But I'm wondering, Ginger, at a very high level, what do you think all this does to kind of misconstrue or construct our ideas of safety, justice, or even just morality in general? Do you think it has an impact on that? What we think of as being safe or just?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think there's been tons of studies that have demonstrated this. I mean, I certainly have my own anecdotal experience and our cultural experience, but there's also been studies. I'm in the field of mass communication, and people like George Gerbner and others have done studies that say, when people see a world that looks dangerous and you get exposed to all this media that's telling you that your world is dangerous, and not really educating you about the conditions under which it really is, why, if there is harm. Because, again, let's be clear, the media is playing a certain role, but there are certain communities, both black communities and white communities and otherwise, where there is real harm and violence, and you don't have to turn on the
Absolutely.
TV to see it. But when you believe that you just live in this dangerous world, it makes people more receptive to authoritarian power.
Mm.
They just want quick solutions, and they're more likely to, in a way, they want to believe in the wrong kind of magic, I think, right?
Ah.
Because because everybody knows that police don't really, I mean, I say everybody knows, but police mostly don't stop crime from happening. They're going to come in after, like, I have, I've lived to live in Philadelphia, and and like, you know, West Philly, North Philly, where sometimes you have intra-community harm, the police aren't coming before the shooting happens. They're
Yeah.
coming after. And they're actually not really interested in coming before the shooting happens, right?
Mm.
And of course, that's just, I don't want to even prioritize that particular kind of harm, but I just use that example because even there, right? So I think, I was just thinking, like, our whole sense, a lot of my thoughts on this, I just want to back up and say, I'm indebted to people like, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba. I mean, these are the people I read, and they put me onto other reading lists of other scholars all over the world who are saying, how do you actually think about what harm is? I remember Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, the thing that motivated us, and I want to be careful. This is my paraphrasing of what I understand her quote is, because I don't want Ruthie coming after
Yeah.
me. But she said, the thing that motivated us was, what are the conditions under which people turn to violence to solve problems?
Mm.
That was the question and that's the question I think we need to be centered in. But I don't think that the media that we see invites us to ask that question. And I don't think that the cops are focused on that question. Are cops focused on the conditions that are, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
if they were, every cop would be a radical leftist. They would be a black liberation thing if they were focused on the conditions. But they're not. They're the opposite of that.
Treating the symptoms, not the actual disease. Yes, and not
Yeah.
even really treating, but just attempting to engage that. Um, and actually, I'll save this example, but I thought of Minority Report when you were speaking of trying to solve crime before it happens, and these predictive crime capabilities like pred policing and how that's been operating in certain communities.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
yes, indeed.
Yeah, and what is that algorithm that's out now that's being used? I forget the name of this algorithm, but there's an algorithm that actually is functioning just like Minority Report in the real world.
Mm.
It's based on kind of like predicting neighborhoods where stuff is
Yeah,
happening, and has actually led people to become victimized, because it suddenly sends the cops to people's doors who had not committed a crime, and there's all kinds of things I'm hearing about where this is happening over the city. It's real life Minority Report starting to unfold. Um,
absolutely.
but one thing I want to say too, when we think about the popular culture is, like I teach media. One of the things I teach is media studies, right? And
Yes.
you remember you started out, and one of the reasons why I love coming to Push Black is that we can look into these media things, and we can study it as something serious. But I tell my students all the time, this also gives me, in a way, more pleasure. Just the
Yeah.
process of trying to think through the media in deeper ways. Not that I'm getting pleasure from the harm part, but
Yeah.
just to try to make sense. Looking at the media as a puzzle, right? Is and I want to invite people into that. Not don't look at thinking about, we want to talk about whatever your favorite show is, and we
Mhm.
gonna and because we about to, because I hope we're gonna go in on some of these shows.
Oh yeah.
Don't look at it like we trying to hate on the show. Look at it like we trying to solve. We're trying to think in deeper ways. It gives you more reasons to go back and watch it again. Like, oh wow, I never caught that. Right? It's partially a pleasure thing, right? As
Yeah.
well. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, before we jump in and do what we came here to do on these media properties, and we're gonna be fair, it's a negotiation.
Yes.
Just got one quick question before we move into this
Oh yeah,
segment.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, Specifically, I'm very curious about the relationship between policy impacts and the visualization of criminality as it relates to Black persons, Black people, Black communities, the consequences of propaganda on just Black life in general. I really appreciate how you mentioned the Rogue Gallery. I forget the gentleman's name who created
George
this work.
Matzel, yeah.
Yes, yes. Reminded me of Alphonse Bertillon.
That's right.
Um,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So for folks who are unfamiliar with Alphonse Bertillon, he was a late 19th century criminologist, right? And he created this criminal portrait series where he tried to create a scientific classification for identifying a criminal. And this was really like the birth of the mugshot in this particular historical context. With all that said, though, just to make it much more relatable for us here, Push Black, can you identify a particular concrete consequence of this sort of kind of fear mongering, visualizing criminality? You spoke about vagrancy earlier. Yes, I'm wondering if anything else to add there.
Well, I just think that, I think one of the biggest examples you can look at is what has happened in the world since 2020, right? Because
Mm,
we've all lived through this in the past 2 years. In June of 2020, the entire world was on the streets. There were, I was getting calls like I had never gotten before. Tell us, the Washington Post, tell us the history of police, right? People were deeply interested and invested in getting at what are the conditions, right? An abolitionist way of beginning to think about this, about harm, right? And realizing, just there was this moment where the assumption that police are going to be the solution was shaken loose for a minute. And people actually opened up and said, well, what are the solutions? We may
mm,
not have all the answers, but we're recognizing that what happened on that George Floyd tape and what happened on also all this other media that we've seen, this cannot go on. And if this has been going on for 175, 200 longer than years, we need to think about that. That's where folks were at. And people were in the streets for that all over
mhm,
the world,
mhm.
right? less than 2 years later, right, you were in a different situation. What happened in between? You had media talking about a crime wave. You had the New York Times talking about, in the city where I live now, oh, the subways are under siege. You had people talking about, now that they're talking about defunding the police, crime is going up. This was a narrative that was without any empirical basis. And yet it got taken up because it resonated with what some people already wanted to think. It resonated with people's fears. In fairness, there are some people who might have been experiencing harm and then the story made sense, but the data wasn't there, right? The data was not there at all. And the media was completely driving this. And I remember looking at the midterms as we built up to the 2022 midterms. There was no politician, for example, in a city like Philly, where a police car had been on fire.
Yeah.
There was no politician even willing to be critical of police at all who was on the ballot, except for, people like Kendra Brooks and other city council members, who were courageous to at least still say, we still have to keep the critique of cops, even if we want to solve these problems. So I think that that's an example of how the media shapes it. Now, meanwhile, I'm talking about the news. At the same time, you still had all the true crime. You had the movies. You had the Marvel films, all kind of inculcating a kind of police-friendly way of thinking about these things. And I think that, if you're a politician, right, not only does it shape your thinking about the problem, right, that media, because you're reading, is shaping your thoughts about what your solutions are, it's also shaping the environment in which you have to function. So even if you were a politician who in 2020 was down to try to get past the symptomatic approach, who was really with it and was trying to be accountable in a way and try to use your location to do something, you're now in a political environment because of the media where you got to respond to that, and otherwise you might be out of office. And so there's a way in which policy actually starts to function as advertisement itself. I like to think about policy as media. People are writing these bills, titling them because those bills are going to relate to elections, not because of what the bill is in. But the bill that you're writing for an election is going to impact somebody's life. It's going to put somebody in jail. It's going to lead to somebody getting shot. That's the impact of that. But they writing them bills as media. The bill at this point, political bills, and that's why they cram so much stuff in to these bills. And I think that the media really, and on all sides of it, is really actually impactful. So that's a little bit of it. And I know there's more, there's reports, but that's kind of how I see it.
All right. Now for the segment we all came to see and hear.
Yes.
Yes, critiques of propaganda in our current media ecosystem. Before we dive in and talk about very specific media properties that we may all know and love, um, I really want to try to just lay out the relationship between policing and the production of some of these media properties. I feel like this is a bit of a nuance people miss when we encounter these properties. Specifically, the relationship between police departments and the film industry, very much a reciprocal relationship. I'm thinking about vice cover-ups for actors, and how police were absolutely relevant in that context. I'm thinking about police being hired as consultants on set in the script production process, but also like police newsreels screened before films. With all this said, Chenjerai, I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit about the relationship between policing and the film industry, as it functions almost like PR, just behind the scenes. Have you seen any instances of this, like police actively shaping narratives that we receive?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, you said it well. I mean, these histories are really intertwined. I mean, I will say, that you think about the Keystone Cops, and maybe we'll
Mm,
talk more about that later. But this is the cops being really depicted as clowns. There was a group of police chiefs who really responded to that portrayal in the 20s, as I understand it, and really went to Hollywood and said, we would like to see something different. So this is a group of law enforcement people trying to have a direct influence on Hollywood in that way. And then August Vollmer, who was known as, he's one of the fathers of modern policing. It turns out there's several of these people who claim to be that, but he's one of the OG ones.
okay.
He was fought in the Philippines and came back and then figured out how he could sort of deploy that imperial gaze and technology onto in California and then across
Mm,
the nation. But he was very much involved in the film industry. If I'm not mistaken, I don't know if he was in a film himself, but he definitely had strong relationships to Hollywood. And I mean, from there, like, partially when you have this industry, right, where, I mean, I would say there's a couple things. When you have an industry where police are so much stuff focuses on police and crime. You have police functioning as consultants. You
Hmm.
know, they need access to police cars. So the NYPD has a whole sort of Hollywood branch to it where you can get cars, actors, access. I mean, if you think about it, there's some context in which wearing like a shirt with like the NYPD on it, I mean, that would be like illegal. Like you're pretending to be a cop, but that's for sale. And part of why that has been developed is because they have relationships to Hollywood. I mean, it's also its own merchandiser fundraising thing.
Mm.
But so yeah, there are, and then for you think about podcasts, the police produce here, the NYPD produce several true crime podcasts themselves.
Whoa.
And so I think that and then the last thing I would just say is that, police uh departments like the NYPD, the LAPD, and many others have huge PR budgets, increasing PR budgets. I'm talking about with sometimes it's over like 50, 60 people just working in police PR,
Whoa.
right? And if you think those PR people are not influencing Hollywood and news and every other genre, you're wrong. They are. And so we just have to understand that like there's tremendous resources being put in, and because Hollywood and media companies often want that access,
Yeah.
they are a little bit vulnerable to that. You know what I'm saying? And that's what I think we have to kind of it's those relationships that are what have to also be attacked
Yes. Yes, indeed.
or
Oh, wow.
critiqued. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for laying that out. Well, shit, let's dive right
Yeah.
in. I want to talk
Yes.
about some subgenres of
Yes.
propaganda.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yes, indeed. I was a bit nervous prepping to talk about this because, to be honest, in full transparency,
Yeah.
I used to be a huge advocate of propaganda when I was a child. Specifically,
Mm.
one of my favorite media properties was Beverly Hills Cop.
Oh
Um,
yeah, Beverly Hills Cop. Ding,
yeah, I
ding,
tell my
ding,
mom
ding,
all the
ding,
time.
ding,
I
ding,
literally thought
ding,
that's
ding.
what police work was. I thought I'd get to say the funny one-liner and jump off a bridge or something like that and catch the bad guy.
Yeah.
Um, yes, indeed. In thinking about Beverly Hills Cop, and we're absolutely going to talk about the positioning of black cops in this sort of media, but I'm really curious about the buddy cop genre. Does that
Right.
resonate with you at all? Do you have a particular history with the buddy cop genre? What comes up for you when you think about these sort of pieces? So I'm thinking about Bad Boys, new one's about to drop, like I think this weekend or next weekend or something.
Right.
Um, Lethal
Well,
Weapon, yeah,
yeah, Lethal Weapon. I mean, I think that Beverly Hills. I just want to go back to Beverly Hills Cop because I know that's old people like what Beverly Hills Cop. Even though they're coming out with a new one, I heard there's a
yeah.
new Beverly one. There's one on the way. I was like, oh, maybe. I mean, I was definitely excited about that, and that was. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say that fortunately, hip hop was there to kind of save me and offer me a vision of something that was actually cool. but I used to think that Eddie Murphy's character Axel Foley, this sort of real hip cop, is cool, and he's like tricking the cops and putting bananas in the tailpipe and all kind of other stuff, and I think there's a lot you can look at with what's at work there. On one hand, it is kind of a buddy component to it because he winds up working. He goes to a different police department, so there's a kind of
Fish
a
out of
fish out of
water.
water, but he's
Mhm.
working with these other cops. It's a kind of racial. It's a racial. There's often this racial
Yeah,
harmony aspect of
Detroit,
it,
like
right? Detroit. So
mhm,
he's authorizing. So as a black, this is like the way in which the black cop is authorizing law enforcement, right? Meanwhile, are you really, we're not looking at the conditions of what was happening at that time in wherever because he was from Detroit and he goes to, is it LA? Where Beverly
yeah,
Hills,
yeah,
obviously.
Beverly
Yeah.
Hills, yeah.
We're not going to talk about what black people were being subjected to there. This does not show up in the film in any kind of meaningful way. But if you're going to talk about cops in Beverly, what's the real Beverly Hills cop talking about? You know what I mean? So, so I think that that's important. Even though there is a class narrative, right? Like he's in Beverly Hills, and that's part of the story, right?
Ah,
So that's it's like that's what's going on. And then the idea that there's also an interesting like the racial component. Like he's smarter than the other police, but it's the idea because he's streetwise, right? It's almost like his blackness is literally the part of his thing that makes him, this smarter detective. And the other piece I want to say too about it that is that, often what's weird is the most of the cops in Beverly Hills Cop are kind of seen as they still are clowns in a way. They're still Keystone cops. It's
yeah,
only Axel Foley who's the redemptive figure. He's the one who's like sharper than them, right? And they're all eventually he's at one point seen as wrong and a rogue, and then in the end he's proven he's right. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying? So
yeah.
it's interesting, and that's actually the world of justice that we're presented in Beverly Hills Cop. There's nothing about any, anything going on with actual material conditions in the world. The wrong that's happened is that there's a crime committed. A smart black cop knows that the crime is committed. He won't get his credit, but in the end, he does.
Ah. Oh, ooh. I love that voiceover. I wish we could record that for a different trailer for the new one coming out. You know what comes up for me when I think about Beverly Hills Cop as you were speaking? I love the nuances around race that are kind of there, but not really explicit. There's one particular scene that stands out for me when I think about just the one moment where race does start to kind of appear a
Mm,
bit explicitly. So in the first Beverly Hills Cop film, when Axel Foley is approaching some businessman in some corporate tower and he's thrown out, but not only is he just removed and thrown out, he's thrown out of a window. And then he's arrested by the cops and he can't believe that he's being forced or facing this sort of injustice, right? This black
right,
man literally thrown through a window out onto a
right,
sidewalk, and then he is arrested and he's kind of flabbergasted. He can't understand why.
right.
Do you feel like that somehow touches upon race at all? Do you feel like that's not so much that could still function if that was a white actor?
Yeah, I mean, I got to remember that scene, but I think what I think is interesting about a scene like that is that it's when you see an instance of police brutality, it is presented as a character flaw of the police, right? So
Mm.
some cop went too far, and they were like a rogue cop who went too far, and then this sets up these narratives like he probably needed training, or he's the kind of cop who shouldn't be a cop. Like through the narrative, the institution of policing is going to be restored. But
Mhm.
Naomi Murakawa said at one point, she said the phrase police brutality is redundant.
Mm.
You don't even have to say the brutality part because there is no such thing as policing without brutality and violence. And the
Mm.
idea that you have to actually add another noun onto it is kind of like it acts as though there's some kind of policing that doesn't involve violence.
Yeah.
And so that's what I think we don't get right in that moment. They're like, we're going to show it, but we're always going to show it as something that can be removed from the overall institution, because by the end of the story, the institution of policing has to be redeemed.
Yes, yes. Okay. Quick counterpoint. Quick
Yes,
counterpoint.
yes.
There is one big media prop. Actually, there's so many, but we just talked about Bad Boys. I feel like the
Yeah.
way in which brutality, violence from the police that occurs in those films, it's not really denigrated, right? It's not really
That's
a
a
cause
great
for
point.
concern, right? It's like it's fun, it's desirable. I'll never forget when I reappraised Bad Boys 2 and the depictions of Haitians in that particular film.
Ooh,
Yeah,
that's a
and
good
just
one.
the immense amount of actually, it wasn't even just Haitians, even like the Colombian folks, right? Like our global South folks.
Right,
But the violence that occurs in those Michael Bay movies,
right.
it's just so eye-poppingly like dynamic and desirable, but it doesn't seem to make any sort of critical statement whatsoever. I guess my question is, do you feel like the comedy that takes place in the buddy cop genre, does it make that brutality more palatable, more accessible? Do you think it shapes it at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question to say. What is the relationship between the kind of buddy dynamics, right? That sort of that what is the relationship of that to these? Let's just, I mean, Michael Bay did Bad Boys, right? It's like just absurd spectacles of violence in all of his films.
Yes.
Right? I mean, his films to me are all comedy films because they're just like, what is going on? Like, we're just waiting for the next setup to blow a lot of things up. Everything falls everywhere. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know. When I put on my like media eye, and I'm sure like there's right now, I guarantee you, listening to this, if there's any of my like scholars, there's probably like 20 people who've written on this, and they're like, no, say these things. I what I would say is, one thing I think about is one question I often ask is like with a lot of these films, there's a weird Tarzan element to it. This is gonna seem weird to say,
Okay,
but
okay.
I was watching after I watched the film Avatar one time. I said Avatar is Tarzan. It's just like it's just like blue Tarzan or whatever, right? It's just like this idea that like the colonial hero is gonna come into the chaos and master it, right? So
Mm,
when you were talking about the depiction of Haitians, right? Haitians and have to be depicted as like what we're really getting is the depiction of a jungle,
Mm-hmm.
right? A savagery, a savage jungle that has to be mastered. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And the only way it's going to be mastered is by equally spectacular violence,
Ooh.
right? And
Yeah.
that's kind of what is at the core of a lot of this stuff. So the violence is celebrated because they're going to show you such horrific savagery that now you expect to see, you know what I'm saying? Like all the guns blazing and explosives and car chases or whatever it is
Yes,
to
indeed.
master the savagery. It's really a story about that. And then in that, if we think about it in that context, the bonding that happens between these two main characters, and this is a real general sloppy analysis of Bad Boys, but you know, I just remember like with a lot of war films, what happens is that the way that we are brought in emotionally to something that should just be like horrific, right?
Mm.
To straight up military propaganda is the bonding between the soldiers, because in a way we can relate to that. You know what I'm saying? We're
Yeah.
like, yo, if I was on the front lines, would I have my person's back or not? You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so because we get drawn into that intimate personal drama, or the drama between Martin Lawrence and Will Smith or whatever, now we're still not zooming out to say what is going on here. Where are we at with like where what is going on with the working class who's facing oppression? What is going on in the world where America is leading to climate change, and wars are being supported, and people are facing conditions in them neighborhoods that you car chasing through. Like all of that
Mm.
is out, really mostly out of the picture. Instead, we just get savage Haitians and explosive car chases and gun scenes to save the situation.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Oh my God. No, so many brilliant bars dropped. Thank you so much for that, Chenjerai. Let me try to just grab onto one of these real quick. I'm thinking about another dynamic that takes place within the context of these buddy cop dramas. I love how you talk about the intimacy and the bonding between these lead
Right.
characters. Right now, I'm thinking about Lethal Weapon, and
Oh
actually,
yeah.
yeah, just the title alone, right?
Right.
Lethal Weapon, right? Come
Right.
on now.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so Mel Gibson's character, Riggs, is this suicidal loose cannon, right? And we're made to
Right.
kind of identify with his tragic backstory, which somehow excuses some of his loose cannon behavior.
Right.
I'm curious, what do you think about just the loose cannon kind of
The loose
archetype,
cannon.
and,
Yeah.
and and then the foil against like the good cop, bad cop type of thing that happens within these buddy cop dynamics? Do you find like, yeah, 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 anything to say about just a
Yeah.
loose cannon
No,
thing?
it's a great thing. I mean, I think there's so much going on there, but one of the things I think that's going on is that um it's interesting, right? Like one of the big contradictions of policing, right, is that policing is ostensibly like one of the propaganda terms we're given to talk about policing is law enforcement.
Mm,
A lot of people call them law enforcement. Our dominant media outlets refer to police as law enforcement. Even when they're talking about a cop who broke the law, like they're like law enforcement broke the law. In this, I mean, that's essentially what a lot of these stories are, right? It's ridiculous, right? Their job is not law enforcement, right?
mm,
Their job is to discipline people, in all these different ways. But the reason why I say that is one of the ironies is that, you know, one of the things police hate the most is that they have to obey the law. The
yeah.
law is the obstacle to policing. And I think that when you think of the loose cannon, that's an expression of this fundamental contradiction. So what you have, right, is on one hand you have a cop who kind of is like the rule book person, but the lesson is almost always you need that savage inside the police system, right, to be unleashed. And what the narratives and stories do, whether it's Lethal Weapon, whether it's Dirty Harry,
Mm.
whether it's like what was the Shield? I forget what the name was. Was
Oh,
Vince? Was his name Vince? I forget what the guy Shield dude's name is. They're gonna show you some horrific, they're gonna show you like a child molester. They're gonna show you something that in you, the viewer, and you're like, bring him in there so he can just go in the room with there, whether it's homicide, right? With Frank's gonna get him in the box. I mean, Frank is not the one who's necessarily brutalizing them. You know what I mean?
mm,
He's kind of defeating them with the mind. But you want somebody in there who's gonna unleash and let loose. And there's this sort of idea, right? And I think that's weird because again, it's law enforcement. But the idea is that cops really need to be able to do whatever they have to do. And I think that
mm,
idea has been defended in policy over and over again.
Yeah.
Why can we in this country at the state level not get any, like, I don't believe that the law is going to rescue us when it comes to police. I just want to be clear. Like, I don't think that like setting up the right policies and bills in the end of the day, I think we're going to need more fundamental revolutionary change to get at these, to fix this problem. But why can't we in 200 years of a failing institution that has, I mean, I just two examples in Philly and New York. There has never been a 10-year period in the history of the NYPD or the Philly PD where they function without massive systemic scandals. Not a 10-year period. They're massive. I'm not talking about like one cop. I'm talking about like no whole bunch of cops. Listen, it's so pervasive that I could take any random day. The day I was born, the front page of the New York Times said that over 200 pounds of heroin was stolen from the evidence room. Just, that's a random day in the NYPD history. The day I was born, boom, 200 pounds was stolen. It was found to be more. And my point is to say, why can this institution then not have be regulated at all? You know, like, and you can't even pass these basic bills. And the reason why is because deep down, the fundamental understanding is what you see in these films. Yes. That the lethal weapon, the Mel Gibson, is what we need.
Yeah.
That's ultimately what we need. We need that person who's going to go savage.
Yeah. Okay. All right. At least to one of my producers, I apologize for where we're about to go next. What you're saying right now really reminds me of another very popular loose cannon in our media ecosystem. Thinking about superhero films and thinking about one person I feel like is like the top cop. Like when you say, oh, we need this savage to kind of combat like this greater savagery, this chaos right outside the gates. Batman. My gosh. Batman. Not only does he work with the cops, okay, we can excuse that. Okay. Just his method of achieving justice. And let's make it more concrete using one media property. Let's just say The Dark Knight, right? So the 2008 film starring Heath Ledger as the Joker, you know, Christian Bale as Batman. Any thoughts there as it relates to Batman's mode of policing and this notion of a loose cannon that we absolutely need? During our check-in, we spoke about this issue of surveillance that comes up in that film that continues to play out today. What do you have to say about Batman to the people?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it, right? You said it so clearly. And then, you know, I'll say something about Batman, and then I want to say something about the villains, because the villains are always really interesting as well.
The villains, okay.
Right? Because they're always in relation when we think about what are these concepts, how does this propaganda shape our understandings of order and even justice, right? But yeah, the most recent Batman film was fascinating because the relationship to the cops was so explicit, where he's almost in this like second scene, he's brought into the crime scene and he's there doing the detective work. Like there's just not even really a moment of distance. You know, obviously the other cops, he's like the boss detective who's like just happens to be dressed in a bat suit, and it's like a kind of emo, it's like a big emo bat suit kind of goth dude who also is like got the better equipment and technology, while the other cops are just sitting there. Well, again, the other cops are there, right? And I mean, of course, this is Gotham in this depiction, so you know, a lot of cops are probably on the take themselves. We're going to find out and learn, you know, and I think that is where, again, the police genre is interesting, and it tells on itself in all these ways, right? It does do the propaganda work, but it tells on itself. It is all because you want to tell a complicated story. But I think that Batman really, I mean, the idea that like you have a billionaire. I mean, people have said this, but I just really have to just sit with that for a minute. The idea that there could be this popular media series which involves the idea of a billionaire who's going to fight crime by going out to punch street criminals. I don't think, you know, look, maybe everybody has a role to play. People have different takes on whether billionaires have a role to play in our things or not. But my thing is, if you have a role to play, it's not putting on a bat suit and going to beat people down. Like what about policy? What about this? Now, in the most recent Batman is interesting because we are given a kind of progressive black woman politician who does seem to have some of that kind of thing on the table. And I guess that in a way we're meant to see Batman as somehow not really in solidarity with her, but you know what I'm saying? Like, but yeah, I mean, and it is interesting because Batman has some really interesting villains. I think the most interesting thing for me about Batman are the villains, because the DC villains are mostly like anarchists, right? I mean, and the thing is that they're mostly right. The villains are right. Like if you look at the critiques, listen to the speeches of Bane or the Riddler or the Joker. I mean, the Joker is saying the thing we're saying right now. He's like, look, dog, you like me. You a thug. Come on, man. You know, they're right. And so it's interesting how they build up these tremendous critiques that are right, that are correct. But then what they have to do is they then try to delegitimize radical ideas, because what they sort of do is they make one last move where they say, these people actually just want to kill everyone. They're self-serving. And I think what the message that's sending is, you can't trust radical people.
Yeah.
You can't trust people with radical critiques of society, because even if the stuff they say seems like it makes so much sense, at the end of the day, they're just really doing it they're self-serving. I just got to give a shout out to my brother Len. I don't know how he feels about Magneto, but Magneto's another great character. I mean, look at Magneto. Magneto is telling you, he's like, look, these people don't love us. He greets his fellow mutants. He's like, brothers, there's love there, right? He loves it. Be proud of yourself. He's the one giving you like the powerful black. He's telling, I forget the cat name, the blue cat or whatever. He's telling them like, yo, be proud of yourself. Mystique, be who you are. All things that are all facts.
Yes.
It's just that. And then he turns the guns back on the state. You know what I'm saying? Magneto, when he kills with the weapons you tried to turn on me. That's so powerful.
Yes.
At the same time, then he just goes that last, him, the Joker, all of them have to go that last thing. And they're like, well, now we're just actually going to kill everybody. Yeah. Which is actually not a good representation of radical ideas. Right? I mean, look, people don't want to go here, but I don't know if we want to do we want to bring T'Challa into this analysis?
I was biting my lip. Look. Okay, we just Killmonger alone. That dynamic.
Exactly.
Hey man, look at what his intentions were. And then you have the Black Panther partnering with the CIA.
That's it. There you go.
Yeah.
To kill essentially his cousin, right? Who's the only. Now I want to tread carefully. We got to do a little Killmonger disclaimer.
Okay.
Killmonger killed the black women. He messed up the herbs. He killed a lot of people. Those are not things we celebrate. We have to condemn those things. But this is he's like the only African-American character in the film. Let's keep it real. He's super relatable, because even how he was cast, right? That film magic, what they really did with that Killmonger was now it leaves me. Fruitvale Station.
Yes.
They pulled on that Fruitvale Station power of his character there. You know what I'm saying? Oh. This is how police brutality is in it, right? You know what I'm saying? They pull on that Oscar Grant, you know what I'm saying? And they pull it. So you're feeling, you know what I'm saying, Michael B. Jordan as that. Yeah. He's relatable. He's way more relatable than T'Challa and other people.
Yeah.
But right? And then all these things, but yet, he again has to be delegitimized. While the CIA officer, does the CIA like strike the final blow in the film?
Yeah. Shoot down the resources. Killmonger's trying to send other black people across the globe.
And look, media is complex. I'm gonna keep it real with you. When I went to go see Black Panther with a crowd full of black people, I was in tears.
Yeah.
When they came up with the spaceship and the black people in the African clothes, bro. I'm sorry. Some of it I'm getting older. You cry easier, bro. I was in tears. I've never felt and seen this kind of stuff in my life, and I thought it just hit me. But then, got out the film. I went back. I saw the joint like 4 times. And after 4 times, I was like, "This is the most counter-revolutionary film." Not the most. Let me shout out. Not the shout out, but I just was like, "Yo, there's some counter-revolutionary things we got to grapple with," and that's the fun of it. That is the fun of thinking about media this way. Is you can enjoy it. You can be in there. You can, you know what I'm saying? In this, So anyway, yeah. But we offer Copaganda now, sort of.
No. Okay. But to bring us,
it's T'Challa. It's T'Challa a cop.
Look, man. I had a whole spiel about Iron Man, the Avengers, Iron Man being a weapons manufacturer. We're gonna table it. We're gonna have you back on Chenjerai. We absolutely gonna get into militainment. And
a friend of mine called him Barack T'Challa, but
Barack T'Challa.
We'll come back later on that.
Oh,
I'm
y'all bear
sorry.
with
All
us.
right, well, I know we got to wrap it up. All right.
Yeah. Okay. No, I want to talk about another nuance
Yes.
portrayal of policing. Some would say this is like the preeminent or most progressive depiction of police work, specifically as it relates to just the Black community and misconceptions around criminality, how the sociology of a city impacts the depiction of crime, all those things. The Wire. Yes, indeed. We were talking about it with the producers before we hopped on with you, Chenjerai, and it's a negotiation. It's hard to label The Wire as just pure propaganda or
Right.
just being purely progressive in its depiction of what policing potentially could be. Have quite a few questions here, but just at a very high level, how do you receive The Wire today? Especially learning about the origins of policing, especially about learning about your own history with Baltimore. Um, yeah. Any high level commentary on the Wire before we get into the
Yeah. I mean, I
rest?
think it's The Wire is. I just think there's no way around the fact that The Wire is a brilliant piece of media, and it's one that is brilliant because of what it tells us about, as you said so well, the sociology of sort of Black Baltimore, Black America, the relationship between policing, the media, education, politics, but also because I think that particular text influenced what people understood could be done with television. Right,
Mm-hmm.
it comes at
Yes.
a moment when television is kind of having a sort of a renaissance, for lack of a less colonial term. but like, it really did kind of say, oh wow, you can do a lot with this genre. Look, now you got these episodes, right? Because there was a time when people didn't think of TV as serious. Film was the serious
Yeah.
media,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And The Wire, I mean, the way you're invested. So that was, it was like, now that's, we're used to that, right? But so I would just say, as somebody, I think you use a great term, that it's what we say sort of in the scholarly world, that this text is ambivalent, right? It cuts different ways, right? There's
Yeah.
a lot in it that it does well. It gives you the sociological account, it gives you the way that we're going to see the way these different, we're going to learn about these people who are in The Wire, these people who are selling drugs, who are participating in underground economies, who are even some of the darkest characters, who seem like, who in other media are portraying it in really one-dimensional ways. Here we're going to see them brought to life with more humanity, but then we're also going to get some historical biographical information. We're going to get into the interpolitics of the policing and detectives. We're even
Mhm.
going to get this moment where you have something like Amsterdam, which is
Yeah.
in some ways a gesture. I learned shout out to Donovan Ramsey, who wrote When Crack Was King, who said, what you see in The Wire in some ways is reminiscent of a real life campaign by Baltimore Mayor Kurt Schmoke to decriminalize
Wow.
drugs, something he was
Wow.
ridiculed for. But we get to sort of imagine that in a different way. Of course, instead of Kurt Schmoke, it's a cop imagining it, which is maybe something we should worry about. But so for
Mm-hmm.
all those reasons, I think The Wire can be dismissed. At the same time, there were a lot of moments in The Wire where I felt like there were some problems. I did feel like there's a sympathy being built with the police officer, the detective. For at least the first few seasons of The Wire, the most sympathetic figure is McNulty,
Yeah.
right? I mean, he's the one obviously, Stuart Hall said, we encode and decode. So I don't know, maybe Black folks ain't necessarily connected to McNulty.
Yeah.
Maybe we
Yeah.
connected to, what I'm saying? We connected to other characters. But at the same time, it's like, because when you have the most sympathy, identification is powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Identification. Who are you when you're invited to identify and see through McNulty's eyes? Um, and his frustrations, because in the end of the day, McNulty is a cop,
Yeah.
and he wants to arrest drug dealers. He wants to get to the bottom. He may not necessarily be interested in mainly addressing, like, arresting like the the most vulnerable drug dealers. So he's not that guy, right? Who
Mm-hmm.
just wants to beat
Mm-hmm.
up and rough up, the corner boys,
Yeah.
right? And because of that, we're meant to identify with him even more, right? But is McNulty asking the questions about, empire?
Mm-hmm.
What is he? Is he really asking the larger questions about the way that this is all arranged? I mean, the series takes us there, but the idea of The Wire and the frustrations, just those scenes. I remember the scenes where the cops are presented as defeated. Not the
Yeah.
thug cops, because there's two characters who are like thug cops, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. A
we're
foil for the good cop. Yeah.
the foil for exactly. And
Mhm.
but even the good cops, right? McNulty and his team are constantly defeated because they actually have to participate in something that is like the kind of like I don't want to say democracy. The fact that they have to get any kind of approval before they can surveil people.
Yeah, it's presented as like an obstacle. Yeah.
So I think that for me is an example of something that's cutting the other way that we need to struggle with about The Wire. And I think that you know, I think that, listen, I think that I got to shout out Alec Karakatsanis, who's coming with a book on Copaganda. It's going to
Okay.
be, I think, one of the best books on it when it comes out soon. He writes brilliant work. And then, of course, there's just a long tradition of authors, like again, I mentioned Angela Davis, Miriam Kaba, Ruth Wilson Gilmer, so many people who are doing powerful stuff with media. But what I love this conversation is that dissecting The Wire, dissecting stuff that's out now, Law and Order, and
Mhm.
asking these questions about it. What is justice? What is justice in this world? Who am I being
Yes.
asked to identify with? What are the root causes of the things, of the harms that get committed?
Yes.
What is, are the cops being redeemed? Is this a good cop, bad cop? Is this Tarzan? Is there
Yeah.
a savage that's coming in here to master the jungle? Who's seen as this real savages here? Like, asking those questions, I think, is a way to undo this propaganda in a way that is related to the media worlds we consume. So you don't necessarily, I mean, I don't want people to study, but you can be studying and having pleasure at the same time. And then at the same time, taking a step forward into even more imaginative media and
Yes.
thinking about other possibilities.
Okay, I love that. I love that as a landing point before we transition to our last segment where we talk about the future in abolitionist media and absolutely the work that you're doing on Empire City right now. But specifically, just to put a cap on the wire and to tie it to our imaginations, one thing that I felt was a limitation was that David Simon, the creator of the show, often talked about it as a Greek tragedy. And he
Mm,
talks about like these postmodern institutions like the law, or the courts, the school system, the political arena. It's almost like modern day Greek gods that kind of control the fates of individuals, and one ethos we live by here at Push Black is we don't want to just tell it how it is. We want to tell it how it could be, which
mm,
absolutely takes place in certain moments in the wire, like
mm.
Amsterdam, as you mentioned. But it does feel too tragic that we can't get a semblance of what systemic change could look like. We only get a sense of how these systems bear down on individuals. And to move forward, to think about abolitionist media, I'm curious if you come across any media properties, whether in text you lifted up a few authors' names, but also visual media properties that really try to think through abolition as practical, as concrete, as something that's necessary, desirable. Have you encountered any works like this?
I remember watching a film a long time ago, and I sort of like shudder to invoke it because I wonder how it how it stands the test of time. But I remember watching this film called Quilombo a long time
Oh,
ago
okay.
when I was younger, when I was in college, and I was like, wow, it was, it was a vision of folks trying to work out, in Brazil. It was they had created a quilombo, like a sort of society of self-emancipated people, and of course they're working out their own struggles in this, and there's all kind of political critiques that can be made of the film. But that was one film where I was like, wow, this is like nothing I'll ever watch, because it actually is envisioning black people, you know what I'm saying, like just
Yeah.
taking freedom in this way. And so, and it was, and it stepped out aside of like, you know the sort of specifics of, I mean, obviously that's a totally different context and different time context. I think we discussed before the project The Interrupters.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that was a really powerful film. And oh man, there's another one that I haven't seen yet that looks really interesting called is it One Light? Oh, I forget.
All light everywhere?
All Light Everywhere. Yeah.
Man,
Have you
folks.
seen that?
Yes, I keep telling the producers I need everybody to watch it. Yes, it's a very important documentary. Details the history of surveillance, but also just the evolution of that and how it plays out in Black communities today. They tour a body cam facility that
Mm.
manufactures this technology, but also pays close attention to how Black communities, specifically in Baltimore, they feature a section where this community is coming together to talk back to this technologist who wants to install this surveillance equipment in their communities.
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah, very rich, very rich. Thank you for lifting that up. And then also there's the work that you're doing on your own podcast right now.
Right. I mean, I feel like I want to get back to you with some more examples because it's funny in my world we traffic so much in critique
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
sometimes those examples that where people are trying to offer a better a stronger vision are like it's hard to immediately call to mind. I bet a lot of them though I would say are probably in the world of speculative fiction.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
That are not, and maybe even like haven't even been raised to the televisual genre yet. Like they're in books, you know what I'm
Yes.
saying, and things like that. But I would say, yeah, we're working on Empire City, and it's an 8-part series about the history of the NYPD. One of the things with Empire City that we really tried to do, because there's been a few pieces recently, both in television and otherwise, that have tried to grapple with the history of police in America.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a beautiful thing. There's Stanley Nelson's, there's Exterminate All the Brutes. That was a powerful series. And there's a new one called Power. I mean, I applaud all of these efforts. But with some more so than others, this question of resistance, right, and moving forward. So for me, in looking back to the 19th century in New York, because we're telling an origin story of the NYPD. Why I thought that context was really interesting was that in addition to New York being actually the first modern developed police department, at least in the Northeast. I mean, we got to, like, I don't want to feed into like really Charleston.
Oh
If you
yeah.
want to, you had some police forces like the Charleston City Guard before the NYPD. But in terms of like what people say are the modern, sort of has the legend of being the first police force. It's people think Boston, but Boston was more so on paper. It's really New York that develops it first in 1845 into an actual functioning institution.
Wow.
And the black people who are up against, let me say it again like this too. The one reason it was really interesting to me to look at the 19th century is that in New York is that black people were in a situation where there was no illusion you could rely on the police. There was no expectation that the police were going to be the ones to come solve crime in your neighborhoods and harm in your neighborhoods, keep you safe, help you assist. Because you're talking about a time when black people didn't have the right to vote and when the prospect of even black social equality is not even on the table. So I was interested not to tell just the sort of story of injustice, but to sort of take on these black New Yorkers as problem solving, as in a kind of imagination and forward thinking. What did they use? How did they grapple? And what can we learn from what they did? Right.
Yes.
And I think that we're doing that. We're trying to do that throughout the course. So we see, for example, that there were times when they actually had to stop the police from kidnapping them. They had to set up night watches in their own neighborhood or in the neighborhood,
Wow.
their own watches, right? They had to sort of institute forms of self-policing. And then you say, okay, but if you have people who are policing our own neighborhoods to make sure we can't be kidnapped, but we're accountable to the community. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Then that function of regulation, which is necessary in some ways for freedom, takes on a whole different character than it does in the institution of policing. You see what I'm saying? And then they also, we talked about what they publicized. We talk about how they had to think about safety and harm. I mean, really, in the end of the day, what's victimizing most people in New York in the 19th century? It's not actually like the way we think of crime today. It's more things like, as people are dying of diseases,
Yeah.
they're dying of poverty. So I say all that to say that I think in the media now, one of the things you've seen, you saw definitely, I think, a big push for this after 2020, right? There was this sense of, we talked about the uprising, and then the media institutions, there was a lot of blackwashing where people were like, suddenly there was investment dollars. We want to tell black stories, black voices here, there, but a lot of those stories were tragedies in the same vein that you were saying, like, The Wire, right? Like, because in the end of the day, the intended audience sometimes, I hate to say it, is a group of people who maybe just didn't realize that history was this bad, or who maybe had faith in these institutions. So people are looking at the goal of that media just to teach these people that, actually the police were never about justice, right?
Yeah.
But I think for black folks, And for oppressed people, that's not really revelatory.
Yeah.
So we know that. We were like, yo, how did people resist? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
How did people fight? How did people solve the problems? Don't tell me something else that's just gonna beat me down and make me depressed. And so that's what I've struggled with in the making of this show, is to try to have that imagination of a future, but also to get into the weeds, though, of how the oppression did occur, because that stuff needs to be entered into the historical record. You know, how we were oppressed, how the role the police have played in that needs to be in our historical record. It needs to be a part of the story New York and America tells about itself. And it's not. Some of the biggest tragedies that happened in New York, which we're going to explore in this show, they're not built into this city's history the way they are like in Tulsa.
Oh.
And Tulsa is just got it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I recall how you all covered the draft riots.
Exactly.
Yeah. That doesn't exist in our popular imaginary of New York.
No, they haven't talked about that. And you know, and again, I don't want to give too much about the show right now, but I will say this: when we were covering the draft riots, and I was walking with the beautiful brother Kamal Ware, who runs Black Gotham, and we were walking down the street, and he's describing it to me. You know, I walk down the street in New York every day, but it didn't hit me. Like, what does it mean to walk down the streets in New York? You might be there with your family. I have a 4-year-old daughter. And all of a sudden, all the white folks in front of you, hundreds of white folks, thousands, turn at you and run towards you to kill you.
Wow.
What is that? You know what I mean? What does that feel like? I mean, I think about it when I'm walking through the streets, you know, because I'm hoping that doesn't happen after November. No, I'm just joking.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Okay, no, we got one last question, fam. Then we're gonna let you go. One last question. Because as you mentioned, you know, so much of the conversation just lands on the tragedy, you know, the ways in which our efforts have been thwarted, and we appreciate the work that you're doing to not only account for how we got here, but also think through ways and strategies that have been tried. I'm going to ask a very speculative question right now, Chenjerai. Very fun question, hopefully.
Yes.
If you were the head of a major network, a major Hollywood studio, you have the capacity to produce and make anything you want.
Right.
What sort of abolitionist story would you want to share with the people? What do you think we need to kind of shift our imaginaries to a more abolitionist mindset? What would you produce?
Well, I think the first thing I would do is bring together people from Push Black. I would try to call Miriam Kaba and other really brilliant scholars I know together. And I would first try to dismantle that studio and give those resources to the people. Let's start there.
Ooh, okay.
because that would actually be more powerful as an intervention than anything I could put on the screen. Far more powerful. I mean, right? But if I had to actually make something, or that we made something, you know, I think that I just want to say there are so many examples, like the example that you gave in the one film that you've seen, where people are solving problems of how to keep each other safe. If that's the question, how do we keep each other safe? How do we create the conditions in which we can thrive and you know, and live our lives, right? People people had to solve those problems in Atlanta, right?
Yeah.
You know, in the last week, there's probably still solving it. The city's saying the water's all good, but you know what I'm saying? Like,
Top city. Yeah.
you know, and so in these situations where in cities all across the world where the police are defunding us, right? People are having to solve these problems in innovative ways, whether they're doing, you know, eviction, de-evicting people and try to keep people in their homes, whether they're doing work about figuring out how to counter some of the surveillance, whether they are, on the front lines trying to put pressure to end the genocide. I mean, there's all these ways in which people are doing that work, and that's the actual work of keeping us safe. Health interventions. Ruthie Gilmore talks about Michael Zinson, you know, the Black Panther who was able to, I think there was a civil, you know, he was able to win a lawsuit for brutality that was done to him. And then he now had these resources. He was kind of in this situation. And what harm looked like for him was to try to solve asthma problems, which took him into the building conditions, right? So this idea that all of our abolitionist work is concentrated around the institution of policing, in a way that feeds into the very thing that we're trying to oppose, which is, no, we're trying to keep each other safe. And if we build a world where, you know, people have, you know, where life is precious and where we have these conditions, we might still need some form of protectors,
Yeah.
But the idea that the institution of police are those protectors is historically ridiculous. And so I look to all those I look to all those community examples and maybe would try to lift some of those up, right? And say, let's talk about how people came together and solved a mental health issue, right? So in a weird way, the interventions I would make about police and media would probably not even center police at all.
Thank you. Thank you for that word. Chenjerai, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking time and sharing your brilliant, expansive knowledge with us. We really appreciate you, and we got to have you back on to talk about some more superhero films.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. It's been great talking to y'all, and I love I just respect so much the work that you're doing, and I've learned so much in this conversation. Thank you.
Likewise. Until next time.
All right.
That was Chenjerai Kumanyika, journalist, organizer, and host for podcast Empire City, dropping this fall. Clearly, he has all the gems to share, so don't miss it. And remember, despite what movies portray, reality shows how rarely we see justice or safety through cops or our carceral system. Ask yourself, how might you begin to reimagine justice beyond policing? And the next time you watch your favorite show or movie, whether it features police or not, ask yourself, was that propaganda? Until next week, y'all, be free. You're living in history. At Push Black, we agree with Marcus Garvey when he said, a people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. We believe telling empowering stories on Black life and history can build a more liberated Black future. Being here with us lets us know you probably feel like that's important too. You matter. Your choice to be here matters. It lets us know that you value this work, and you make Push Black happen with your contributions at blackhistoryyear.com. Most people do $5 or $10 a month, but everything makes a difference. Thank you for supporting the work.